Our next speaker is Ray Hughel. Ray Hughel is a recent addition here to the O'Neill Center family here at SMU Cox. He holds his master's in teaching from Louisiana College, and we're not going to hold it against him, but he's a Hoosier, where he got his business degree. He is a former high school teacher in economics, and he taught at South Grand Prairie and Grand Prairie ISD, and is going to talk to us today about, first, about the Food and Drug Administration and the effects of the FDA and regulation in distorting markets. So let's give a welcome to Ray Hughel.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. I happen to know a lot about the FDA. And the reason that I know a lot about the FDA is because I spent the better part of 2 decades working in the pharmaceutical industry. Before I became a teacher, I worked mainly for Bayer Pharmaceuticals, a couple other smaller companies that you might or might not recognize. But I do have a lot of experience being regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Another kind of qualification that I have in speaking to you today about the FDA is I used to work for the Quaker Oats Company. Right out of college, went through the Career Center at Indiana University and interviewed with many companies, Xerox, IBM, so forth and so on. But I chose the Quaker Oats Company, a really good company to work for, food manufacturer. At that time, they were wholly owned. They were the Quaker Oats Company, a large cereal manufacturer, and they were under a lot of regulation from the Food and Drug Administration as well. They're now owned by PepsiCo. I have nice little pensions coming from both of those endeavors in both food and pharma. And so I do have some expertise in dealing with the Food and Drug Administration. So this module was developed by Dr. Jason Brigham. He was at Austin College. He's also a former high school economics teacher. He taught at Vista High School and at Vandergrift High School in the Leander School District. So he has experience filling young skulls full of mush with economic information. The main reason that we talk about the FDA is because we want to talk about the interface between government and economics. And so we talk about the econ classroom and the Food and Drug Administration because we can talk mainly about regulation. But there are several other places to plug this in and to make it work for us to bring the real world into the classroom and help these students, get their fingernails full of dirt so they'll have some idea of what economics really is, not just this pie in the sky, charts on the wall type of experience that most of them come in. Because let's face it, when they come into that classroom, most of them think you're going to talk about money, don't they? And that's what they think it's going to be about. And they may have heard the concept of supply and demand before, but they really don't know what it is. And they want to learn that. So the FDA is a great way to help. So economics and regulation. Since Adam Smith, the main pipeline of economics has worked with the presumption that the system of natural liberty, or what we call today market system, much about what Dr. Trzynski was talking about, with government interventions being justified only when they promise to remedy a solution that the marketplace can't do. That was the whole idea of laissez-faire, right? And I added the little French phrase, ne sais pas, which is it not so? We really believe that laissez-faire works. We don't want the government to overreach. We want it to stay within the realm of not costing us too much and not burdening us with too much regulation, so it hurts innovation and entrepreneurship. Smith actually thought that the government should be stepping in a lot of places. You have to get into the Wealth of Nations and the theory of moral sentiments to figure that out, but he really did think that there were plenty of places that the government needed to step in. So we have food and we have drugs. Food we know is on the baseline of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Everybody has to eat, you have to be able to drink, you have to have a good place to sleep and some shelter. So these biological functions can keep us sustained. But did you know this? That the FDA regulates 20% of our consumer purchases. That's an astounding number. And it may start to help you to envision the fact that maybe the FDA does tend to overreach from time to time, because it's true, they do. So with regard to the market system, all of what the FDA does probably could be categorized as government intervention. If they weren't intervening and people died from taking drugs or eating food that was unregulated, we might just consider it natural selection. So we're kind of defying natural selection when we let the FDA do what they do. But we want them to do that, and we're going to explore that, and you can explore that with your students. So what the FDA regulation does, up to this point at least, is pretty well accepted, right? Most of us expect that when a doctor tells us that it's okay to take a certain medication, that we're going to benefit from it. It's not going to harm us, it's not going to cost us too much, and that it definitely, the opportunity cost that goes with it is not too high. So there's very little research concerning market failures in food and drugs because of the FDA. When they do their due diligence, and this is an important point to get across to your students, when the FDA does their due diligence, we rest assured. We don't say, there's so very few times when we do point to something the FDA did and say, you failed there. Pink slime may be one of those places, true. But there's not very many, are there? And these aren't fresh on our minds, they aren't at our fingertips, there aren't a lot of exposés, white papers being written by journalists or television programs being written on it. So we accept and expect the FDA to do these things for us. But yet, this research that was done by these folks from the Oxford Handbook of Economics said that, ironically, if a product application were presented to the FDA with the scant amount of evidence that currently exists on the efficacy or efficiency of the policies of the agency itself, such an application would likely be rejected on the basis of insufficient evidence. So the FDA would fail their own standards. But yet we still allow them to exist because of the safety concerns that we have. Most of us want to live nice, long, healthy lives with good, high quality of life, right? That's why we let the FDA continue to exist. So this unit that's in front of you on the FDA does these things. It does not use the language of market failure, government intervention. It focuses on the status quo, what the FDA does, will do, and will continue to do. The unit could be used when discussing market failure and the government intervention as a sort of case study or an example if you wanted to use it along those lines. But to me, if you were going to use it that way, its application would probably be in the AP macro setting, because this gets a little high-minded, a little high-browed, if you will, if you start going into those kind of esoteric types of conversations. They could make for good substance, if you wanted to add some substance to your discussion of government intervention and government regulation and the costs thereof. It could also be used without that context or even outside of econ context. So if you're teaching U.S. history, you could use the FDA to illustrate how the government has regulated, yes, the beef market, absolutely, sugar, whatever you wanted to talk about. And don't neglect, I'm glad you said that, don't neglect the food aspect of the FDA, because it's even bigger than pharma in some respects, because it goes across all different kinds of disciplines, agriculture and so forth and so on. So the FDA and teaching supply. This is where I actually used the FDA in my classroom significantly. So we search for tangible, really real-world things and ways to show those 9 factors, or some people say 10 factors, that actually shift supply. I don't know about you, but I always struggled with that to get my students to understand that if it's price, you're not going to shift the line, you're going to stay on the line, right? I used to try to use the analogy, and it worked about 9 years ago, of William Shatner and the Priceline commercials, because they knew what Priceline was. But now they don't know what Priceline is, because Priceline's kind of gone by the wayside. It's, you know, TripAdvisor and all the other methods that are out there. But my point was, my mnemonic was Priceline. If it's price, you stay on the line. So these are the things that are difficult to memorize for them to be testable. And you can use the FDA to help you with this. So this is how this unit dovetails with those shifting factors. The first one is input costs. As input costs go up, obviously the price of pharmaceuticals and or food is going to go up as well. So whenever you see, whenever students ask you, why is it so important, the price of a barrel of oil? Right here's one of your input factors, right? If you have to ship food from point A to point B to the grocery store from the farm or wherever it might be, that's an input cost going up. Technology. We love and crave technology. We know that it's one of the stimulators for the growth of an economy. It's very important. But it also has a cost with it, especially when you're talking about pharmaceuticals. These research pharmacists and chemists, they don't come cheap. They have master's degrees and PhDs, and they get paid nice high prices. Subsidies. Obviously, the government is interested in having research done and having disease states that are poignant, like AIDS, like childhood ailments, cancer, of course, is a biggie. So they subsidize. Ebola, yes. Whatever the du jour is, it could be Zika or whatever it might be. They all have subsidies. They get subsidized, and it worked in the case of AIDS, didn't it? There was a very quick reaction to be able to stem the spread of AIDS. When people contracted it, people are still contracting it, but they can treat it very readily. Taxes, obviously, are government intervention that helps to fund health care. In part 2 of our afternoon setting today, we will talk about health care and the healthcare industry and how taxes are a big part of that. Regulation, we know, drives costs up enormously. This current administration that we have has made the promise that for every one new regulation, they'll do away with 12 or something, I think was the promise. It's actually ended up being more like 22, but that's in the early days. We'll see how long that lasts, right? And import restrictions. This is a huge thing in the FDA, especially the drug side of things, but you may or may not know that pharmaceutical products cannot come into the U.S. from foreign sources. It's just not allowed. It's very heavily regulated. It's why people will go to Honduras or to Costa Rica or someplace in Central America to get the drugs that are prescribed for them, because they cost a lot less and there's a lot less regulation on them. So these import restrictions, which actually President Trump has begun to address, nobody's really sure why he's decided that he wants to put a price ceiling on some of these pharmaceutical products, because price ceilings tend not to work very much, but it's being addressed in some regard. And then, of course, to a lesser degree, tariffs, expectation of prices, and the number of sellers as the shifters of supply. You could tangibly touch on those by using the FDA module, but it'd be a little more difficult.
Well, couldn't you hit number of sellers or the demand part with the drugs that don't get developed for a small group of patients that have a specific disease, but there are not enough patients there to make that drug profitable to produce?
Yes, and the FDA actually, that's a great question and a great illustration. The FDA actually addressed that about 20 years ago, and they came up with a new classification of drugs called orphan drug. And an orphan, in order to get orphan drug status, you have to treat 200,000 or less people, and they guarantee that there'll be no competition. So you basically, it's an in perpetuity patent life for your drug. They won't allow anybody else to make it. So you could try to recoup your investment. So that's I actually represented a drug that was that way. It was alemtuzumab. It's the MAB class are chimerics that they either blend with mice genes, or sometimes it's human genes, fully humanized products. You see lots of them advertised on television now. All the plaque psoriasis drugs, those are all MABs. So, but they granted it to this because they spent a lot of money developing the drug, and its only indication at that time was for secondary use in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And there was no way, there's just not enough chronic lymphocytic leukemia to be able to recoup that loss. The FDA has since lifted that orphan drug status because now that drug has a new indication, and it's for multiple sclerosis. So that's a pretty well-known disease state. There's 500,000 people with that. Yes?
I've had several friends who have contracted ALS.
Yeah.
Have run into that barrier.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I've just got a question. You know,
Sure.
and it's in regard to the FDA, and you worked with the FDA for a while, and within the FDA confinement with your pharmaceuticals. Why does it take the FDA so long to approve other agencies from other countries that have had test results that have gone for 8 to 10 years, like in Sweden or England or Australia, where they've tested certain products on their populations and there's no problems with it? Why haven't they just accepted that as coming in? Is it because there's not money going to be made in our pharmaceutical industry? Is that it?
That's certainly part of it. But I think Professor Tazinski's presentation kind of explained part of that for you. It's about lobbying. It's about lobbying. The big pharma companies don't want that kind of competition. They don't want that. Obviously, most of you know that drugs are a lot cheaper around the world than they are in the United States. So it's mainly about influence and the peddling of that influence.
Yeah, because I lived in Sweden for like 4 years, and there were things that had been passed for many, many years, and they never got to the United States for many years after.
And that can be good and it can be bad. I actually have an example in the presentation that will show out a place where it was actually good at one time. But you're right, having been inside the industry, there were many times when the company that I worked for had a compound in Western European countries, and it was working marvelously and just didn't get approved here because one of the things that the FDA requires, and we'll talk about that in greater detail here in a minute, but one of the things that they require is that there are randomized, placebo-controlled, multi-centered, double-blind trials, which are extraordinarily expensive, and that's their standard. So that's another thing that holds them back. They don't want to violate that standard. When you would go in to see medical people, whether it would be a physician or a nurse or a physician's assistant or a nurse practitioner, and you would present evidence to them, and you would bring in the Lancet, which is a British medical journal, and quote it would undergo really harsh scrutiny because they wanted to see it from the AMA or someplace that was based in the United States. So there's a prejudice there for their products are just not quite as good as ours because they didn't do the due diligence that we do here in the US, which of course is part of regulation and drives up the cost, right? So it's a great place. It's a great place to make your point with your students about regulation, how it drives up costs.
And if you don't do regulation, you could have what you had in the 60s when, what was that, with the people, or with just terrible...
Thalidomide.
Thalidomide, right?
Yeah.
What happened there?
We'll talk about that in a second. So here's your first guiding question for your students. How are food, drugs, and similar products regulated by the government? They may have no idea. Great place to just throw the floor open and have people spitball. You know, just throw out ideas. Somebody goes to the board, writes them on the board, or writes them on a flip chart, and just list all of the ways that people come up with. And it gets them thinking, starts to stimulating them, push them up Bloom's ladder, you know, get it all bloomed up, and make them start to think. So here is what the FDA regulates: food, drugs, dietary supplements, biologics, medical devices, cosmetics. That's actually one of the first places that the FDA got its start. There were patent medicine people going around from town to town selling mascara or eyeshadow that blinded women. you know, or gave them rashes that were extraordinarily bad. And people were like, hey, that can't happen anymore. Well, don't buy stuff from a snake oil salesman, right? But it had to be regulated. And then veterinary products, an enormous category of drugs and food, for that matter, that are very expensive and very deep in their scope. I remember when I was working for Bayer, one of the products that I represented was ciprofloxacin, which is a fluoroquinolone. It's a synthetic antibiotic, broad spectrum, and treats a lot of gram-negative bacillus and like E. coli and things like that. And my dog was sick, and I took my dog in, and he put him on doggy Cipro. I was like, oh, wait a minute, I promote this drug. Sorry, you can't use your drug. You got to use the veterinary one. And then radiation emitting electronics. So all the scanners that we go through at the airport are another thing that the FDA regulates. So that is really wide range of things, isn't it? No wonder 20% of consumer products are affected.
Radiation emitting electronics.
And that's a great question. Why wouldn't it be some other agency that would do that? Who made those decisions? Is this overreach? Is this an example of overreach? And it might be. You know, how in the world does that have anything to do with food and drugs?
Yeah, within those broad categories, there are segments like a food that aren't regulated by FDA, or segment of dietary supplements that aren't. And you could go through each one of them and say, well, this is and this isn't.
Yep.
And then you could have a great conversation about why is this covered and this not.
Totally. Completely. Because here are the other regulators. Meat and eggs, as Dr. Chazinski talked about, the United States Department of Agriculture. Those are food. Why did the USDA end up with those and not the FDA? Alcohol and tobacco, those are consumables. Why aren't they covered by the FDA? But instead they're done by alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Actually, it's ATFE now. You know, they've added explosives to that. Controlled substances. So Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs are controlled by the DEA. So heroin, marijuana, methamphetamines, things like that are handled by the DEA.
But who chooses whether they go on that schedule or not? Doesn't the FDA choose that?
Yes, the FDA does make that schedule. Yes, so now you're starting to see
The overlap.
the overlap, and the overreach of the overlap costs taxpayers money, right? Because we're basically paying for redundancy. Now, some redundancy is good. I mean, I'm glad I have 2 kidneys. I'm glad I have 2 lungs. But do we need 2 people watching over the same types of drugs? Non-radiating emitting electronics by the Consumer Protection Consortium. Tap water and pesticides by the Environmental Protection Agency. Advertising of consumer products by the Federal Trade Commission. And then there's also medical practice. There's 50 of these state medical boards that regulate food and drugs, especially those. So this is a great place to say to your students, look at all the government intervention that happens inside our society and our civilization. It's an amazing, all-encompassing factor that sometimes we gloss over. We tend to forget it. So I have to have a Venn diagram, right? You got to have a Venn diagram. So this is how government gets a job done. So the idyllic places are, of course, to do it inexpensively, to do it ethically, and to do it on time. But if you try to do it inexpensively and on time, you'll get tyrannical dictatorships. And if you try to do it inexpensively and ethically, you'll get 2 generations too late for something to happen with it. And if you do it on time and ethically, then you got insane tax hikes because people want it now. But if all 3 of them come together, we realize that that only exists in futuristic science fiction novels. So getting government to work perfectly is a panacea, isn't it? It's probably not going to happen. But we want to try to get the best that we can out of it. So it's kind of a funny way of looking at the FDA and the dynamics of economics. So what the FDA does or can do. No new drug can be sold in the United States unless and until a sponsor obtains FDA permission to make and sell it. This is called pre-market approval. Pre-market approval basically begins with a scientist in a laboratory discovering a molecule that has some application to treat some disease state or to improve somebody's quality of life. You register that patent with the FDA, and the clock starts ticking on the patent life of your drug. So, and that's saying that it's a drug, it could be a device as well. So the FDA watches you go through the 4 stages of development. The first stage is basically laboratory, where you're testing it to make sure that it's not volatile or toxic or has some really negative, you push it off and get rid of it because there's no way you could apply it to the public. Phase 2 is when you start testing it in maybe insects or other animals, but not humans. Phase 3 is when you actually take it out and start testing it on human beings in a test population. Sometimes you'll see in the newspaper that a pharmaceutical company is looking for volunteers, right? Of course, you become a paid volunteer because if you have like high cholesterol, back when the cholesterol drugs came out, there was a big wave of people that went into the trials to test Lipitor and all the other hyperlipidemic drugs that came out. And then phase 4 is actually marketing. So it goes to market. So the faster that can happen, the faster the company begins to make profit. So that's important. They can withdraw approval or forbid future sales of a drug or food ingredient. Unfortunately, the companies that I work for, several of the drugs that I represented did get pulled from the marketplace. Speaking of hyperlipidemic drugs, when I worked for Bayer, we had one called Baycol. And Baycol was a really good drug. It had been used in Europe for many, many years, and it finally got approved here in the United States. It was kind of a Me Too drug. That's using Me Too in a positive way. It was like the 4th or 5th anti-lipid drug that was available, and it did really well. We had 3 kind of low doses of it, and it was doing quite well. Well, they decided that they wanted to come out with a higher dose. Well, compliance is a problem with patients, but it's also a problem with physicians. Some of them want to kind of jump to the higher dose really quickly because they want to see immediate results instead of what's called titrating up to a drug dose. And so they came out with this higher dose, and it caused kidney issues because they were shedding so much lipid that it went straight to the kidneys and caused kidney failure, a condition called rhabdomyolysis. And so they didn't just pull that dose of the drug, they pulled the entire drug. It was a real boondoggle. And a sad thing because rosuvastatin was a good drug. Another drug I represented got pulled from the marketplace because of some issues with sensitivity. And another drug that actually I went to work for Bayer from leaving another pharmaceutical company. It was a drug called metriphenate, and metriphenate was an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, which is used in the treatment of Alzheimer's. All those acetylcholinesterase classes are used there. And it had a reputation of being a very safe drug because it was used to treat schistosomiasis in Africa. So people had expectation that this would be a very safe drug. But one of the things they didn't read in the literature was that the older people that were treated for schistosomiasis in sub-Saharan Africa had trouble breathing. And they had some syncope. They were passing out and fainting. Well, if they'd done their due diligence on that, they would have realized that the dose was really important. And so when they got into trial, there were half a dozen or a dozen people who had diaphragmatic muscle weakness. Your diaphragm controls your breathing, and had to be put on a respirator. And they pulled that drug before it even got to market. So it happens more often than people know. The COX-2 inhibitor class pain-killing drugs was supposed to be the next thing to kill pain. There's basically two pain channels, the cyclooxygenase 1 and 2. Cyclooxygenase 1 is where most of the NSAIDs work, like aspirin and ibuprofen, acetaminophen, things like that. The COX-2 is supposed to be this new revolutionary thing that would help people to control their pain. And indeed, they did work, but the liver damage wasn't worth it. There's only one of those drugs that's still on the market. Celebrex is the one, and it's very closely controlled. When your doctor puts you on that, he's like, don't take any more of this, don't drink alcohol with it, and all the other things that go along with that. So the FDA controls that very tightly, very, very tightly. And that costs money, of course. Tight control costs money. They have much power over labeling and advertising. Today, I brought a couple of different examples, and you can pull these off of the internet if you want to show them to your students. This is a package insert, a PI as it's called in the pharmaceutical industry, for estradiol, which is a hormone replacement drug. As you can see, it's a lot of information. It has tons and tons. This is the clinical piece. It has tons and tons of information about adverse events, warnings, contraindications, so forth and so on. And this is tons of research down to minute detail. There are graphs and charts on here about the clinical case studies that were found to demonstrate efficacy and to demonstrate safety and so forth and so on. Then there's another package insert, and this one is designed and developed for public consumption. And this would be actually given to the patient. This is available on the internet. Every drug its package insert's available on the internet. And you can make a whole case study out of that if you wanted to have your students go and look at it. But this is the patient one. Significantly smaller, bigger print, but this one is the whys and the wherefores in common language, everyday layman's language. So these instruments are the way that the FDA has control over the products. They tell the pharmaceutical companies how they can promote and how they can't. And believe it or not, in both of these documents, but in particular in the clinical piece, there's lots of economics. Tons and tons of economical language that's in there. Because one of the things that you learn as a pharmaceutical representative is to sell against your competitor. I sold a drug that was an antiviral, and I sold against, actually the big hitter was GlaxoSmithKline's Valtrex, which is still the #1 antiviral to control things like herpes zoster and things like that. And it was a black box warning on their labeling that helped us to sell to a certain community. They had a big long word that a condition that could be controlled, or actually started by their drug, was thrombocytopenic purpura hemolytic uremic syndrome. Whew, say that 3 times fast. And we had to be able to sell using that and saying, we don't do that, they do. And so I was calling on the homosexual community down in Oak Lawn, the physicians that were down there, and they had all these patients that had AIDS, and they were highly susceptible to thrombocytopenic purpura hemolytic uremic syndrome. And so it provided an economic opportunity for my company to make money based on what was in the package insert for the competing company. So lots of economic opportunity inside these detail pieces. They can inspect facilities and products, and we hear about this all the time. It was the FDA that went to Bremen and found the listeria in the Bluebell plant. It was the FDA that went into the Conagra plant in Georgia and found the listeria in the Peter Pan peanut butter. And those products were off the market for quite some time, weren't they? And it's because of the due diligence that the FDA did.
FDA did the lettuce too?
And the FDA, yes, once it was reported, it was turned over to them, and they did the inspection and the warnings and the public notifications and all that, yes. They can require certain process to be followed when manufacturing, transporting, and selling. My wife represents a product. She's still in the medical industry. She's actually in nuclear medicine. She represents a product that's it's a radioactive tracer that helps to detect recurrent prostate cancer. Well, it's a radioactive product. And so when they transport it, when they mix it and transport it, it has a half-life of 7 hours, so they have to undergo these really strict regulations. If they're going to fly with it, the restrictions are amazing. I mean, it's a radioactive product. If the plane went down, it might toxify a lake or a stream or something like that. So the container would need to be sufficient enough to not allow that to happen.
Is that the
So-
dye that you stick in to check phosphate?
It's a radioactive isotope, and it does kind of go in like a dye, and it's the accuracy of the methods that they were using previous to this compound was about 12%. They could guess where your recurrence was, but this product it's 88%. So they can target the treatment. It's really a marvelous innovation. Obviously, she's in pretty high demand. Here are our fun little nutrition facts. Some of us are probably old enough to remember the days when we didn't have those. But they've been around for quite some time. So the FDA, this is from their website, it says if you're thinking about opening a food business, there are many regulatory requirements that you'll need to meet. Kind of information overload on these, right? I mean, how many of us read all the specificity for all the food products? We don't have that kind of time. Well, some people do, yes, absolutely. Some people do, especially if you've got high blood pressure and you need to know how much sodium's in there. If you have high cholesterol, you need to know all those things. These are very useful. And diabetes, absolutely. You need to know the sugar content, certainly. Yeah, carbs. I mean, if you're eating properly, you love these things. If you don't care,
Oh, and the portion size.
Portion size is important too. And the portion size kind of blows people away sometimes too.
Hey, you get a little bag of chips, and you read on it, there's 3 portions in here?
Yes, a little bag.
Yeah, a little bit.
And cereal is one of the big foolers. You know, yeah, it's all sugar. It's all sugar, and you only get 4 ounces of sugar per sample size. You know how much 4 ounces of cereal is? It's not very much. It's not very much. So you have to know what the nutrition facts will tell you, and that's a life lesson that we can actually pass on to our students, isn't it?
But, you know, sometimes I've noticed that, does the FDA, do they monitor the labels that companies, pharmaceutical companies put on top of labels? So you have to peel it off to read what's actually in the ingredient?
Yes, they do.
So they do that.
Yes, they do.
I thought
All
maybe-
those have to go through
I thought
regulatory
maybe those
approval.
companies are just, you know, they're just avoiding showing what's in the product by putting this actual label on it that you have to remove to see the actual contents of what's actually in there.
Yeah, they do. They still do. So here's our guiding question number 2, asking our students, what mechanisms, including regulation, assure customers about the quality of products such as food and drugs? Great conversation stimulator. What do you think would be one of the things?
Testing. They got testing.
Yeah, testing.
They got research and testing.
Yep.
And they got a demand. There's got to be a demand for that.
You certainly could pull in supply and demand there, couldn't you?
Yeah, there's got to be demand for that.
Yeah. How many of you have ever told your students that that the phrase supply and demand is inverse? It should be demand and supply, shouldn't it? Why would I supply it if there's no demand? It's a cart and horse thing. Should be demand and supply, not supply and demand. So when the FDA gained authority? Well, in 1906, the prohibition on interstate transportation of mislabeled or adulterated food and drugs. So there were several Supreme Court cases that dealt with this, and they realized, the federal government realized that, hey, we're going to continue to have Supreme Court case after Supreme Court case if we don't intervene. Because these states were suing each other mainly over alcohol products, beer and liquor. They were having all different kinds of issues with wine and the transportation of wine and the different laws that were going on. In 1938, pre-market approval of drugs introduced and cosmetic and medical devices were subject to FDA regulation. So prior to 1938, you didn't have to register things with the FDA. They were starting to watch, but you didn't have to do it. And then there were a couple of really landmark disasters with products, and so 1938 heralded that. And then in 1962, the FDA was required to judge drugs not only because of their safety, but also because of their effectiveness. In the medical industry, that's called efficacy. If there's efficacy, then it means it works in a certain population at at a certain rate, and all that stuff's in the package insert. So the FDA was empowered to prohibit the sale of a drug without a doctor's prescription. That was huge. That was huge. So basically, this did away with over-the-counter drugs for a long, long time, until they get deregulated. A perfect example of that is aspirin. My old company, Bayer, of course, came up with the marketing idea of acetylsalicylic acid. But if that drug were to undergo FDA scrutiny right now, it would definitely be a prescription drug. It's a dangerous product. I mean, it causes Reye's syndrome. Its effect on platelets alone would be enough to make it a prescription drug. I mean, when you take an aspirin, it changes the viscosity of your blood hugely. That's why people take that little baby aspirin every day, so they have a heart attack and they won't have such a bad outcome. What else assures product quality? Well, drug producers work to convince physicians, patients, so forth and so on, that they're trustworthy and that their products are worthwhile. Believe me, we in the pharmaceutical industry, when I was in that industry, spent billions of dollars to influence people. The erectile dysfunction drugs have spent lots and lots of money to try to influence people that, Cialis is great to sit in the bathtub with, right? Or Viagra, in the little blue pill, when the moment is right, and all those marketing phrases. Well, they spent lots and lots of money because they realized they needed to stimulate interest there. I represented a product when I was with Bayer. I was actually a hospital rep when it was introduced, so we didn't use it very much in the hospital. But it's Levitra, vardenafil. And one of the marketing pieces that we had was a pin that was purple and orange, and it was about that long. And it was kind of like a weird looking pin, but you push the button on the side of it, and another piece of it went up like that. I mean, we're talking about an erectile dysfunction drug. It was a really good visual. But we spent lots and lots of money to come up with that idea, and oh boy, I'm telling you, the doctors loved that. I want one of those. Physicians, patients, et cetera, look for evidence from producers and elsewhere. And probably the best advertising that there is the good old word of mouth, right? If I try a product and I tell you that it was great, I've influenced you. And it didn't cost them very much money to do that, right? Patients often rely on a physician's advice. How many times have you said to your doctor, you're wrong? Not very many times, right? The only time might be when you're a new patient with them and they don't know that you're allergic to this or that or the other, and you have to, so I'm allergic to penicillin or whatever it might be. That happens sometimes when you're new to a physician, but we really rely on these physicians. So pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money trying to convince them that your compounds are the best. And that's all about economics. That's all about economics. Creating demand so you can supply it.
Carpal tunnel syndrome?
What about carpal tunnel syndrome?
I had doctors who wanted to operate me for carpal tunnel, and I said, no, you're not doing it. Because I looked up, they have a very low
Cure rate.
effectiveness. It's
Yeah.
like 50% and even questionable that.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is that caveat emptor, right? May the buyer beware. And that's another life lesson that we can teach our students, is that they need to do their own due diligence and research something. Now with the information age here, there's no reason as to why they can't be an informed consumer. And that's just good economics. Fraud, negligence, consumers file suits against producers. I mean, how many of those ambulance chasing commercials have you seen from lawyers wanting to help you sue for having mesothelioma or something like that, or the mesh, the mesh things that are out there? There's tons and tons and tons of that. Do these mechanisms for assuring quality work well? Well, that's a key question, isn't it? How sure are we sure about what the FDA does? The FDA imposes these regulations on top of these mechanisms that we've already seen. Isn't it just like overkill? How really critically important is this? I mean, how many of us are going to live forever? Eventually, it's kind of like the final answer of global warming or whatever it might be is, you know, that thing, that nuclear furnace that's 93 million miles away from here, it's going to burn out one day. Shouldn't we be using the finite resources that are here right now if we want to perpetuate our species on learning how to get off the planet? Yeah. So you can get economically philosophical with your students. The better case, of course, is that we hope, you know, that we sure hope that that's the case. The worst case, of course, is you know, we place too much emphasis on them, and then the FDA errs. And probably the cyclooxygenase 2, the COX-2 inhibitors, that probably was one of their bigger failures in the last 2 or 3 decades. They probably should have never approved those drugs, any of them, because the liver damage was significant. And these were in people that didn't drink a lot of alcohol and who were otherwise healthy. It didn't work. Here's guiding question 3. What arguments often are made in support of and against the application of a unique form of regulation to drugs? Well, one of them, obviously, is ethics and morality. Marijuana probably comes to mind, right? We've already got like 8 or 9 states that have approved recreational marijuana usage in defiance of the FDA. The FDA says those are restricted products. And if the federal government wanted to enforce the laws that are on the books, they could march into those states and say, we're shutting you down, you can't do this, you're in violation of federal statutes, including the FDA. Marijuana is a Schedule II drug, which is pretty restricted. But that would be a restraint of trade now, so there probably would be a pretty interesting Supreme Court case. It's probably why the Obama administration and the Trump administration didn't do anything and won't do anything. So FDA regulation is the cost of trial. Consider exploring this topic.
Safe and effective drugs are essential to caring for your patients. So here are 5 things to know about how FDA approves a drug for use. It starts when a drug is investigated and screened. Generally, new drugs are tested on animals before people. Additionally, in some cases, multiple species are used to gather information on the safety of the compound being investigated. The drug sponsor submits an investigational new drug application, an IND, to the FDA based on the results of the initial testing. The application is required to include the drug's composition as well as the details of its manufacturing. The IND presents a plan for testing the drug on humans. The FDA reviews the plan to determine if the proposed clinical trials will put human subjects at unreasonable and significant risk of illness or injury. Generally, there are 3 phases to a clinical trial in humans. Phase 1 emphasizes safety and typically includes 20 to 80 healthy volunteers. Phase 2 emphasizes effectiveness and typically includes hundreds of patients with a certain disease or condition. Phase 3 typically includes thousands of patients and is used to gather more information about the safety and effectiveness in different populations and different doses. After the clinical trials are complete, the FDA looks carefully at all the animal and human testing data, reviews the drug labeling information, and inspects the facilities where the drugs will be manufactured to determine if the new drug is safe and effective. Because it's not possible to predict all of a drug's effects during clinical trials, monitoring safety issues after drugs get on the market is critical. The role of FDA's post-marketing safety system is to detect adverse events and take regulatory action when needed. That's 5 things you need to know about the drug approval process.
And so you show this to your students and they have a great understanding of how the process works. And so much of economics is about process, that this is a very real-world application for them to understand why their grandmother doesn't have a certain cancer treatment or why their brother continues to suffer from leukemia or something along those lines. So pre-market approval of new drugs looks at the uniqueness and the intensity of the regulation form, which made it controversial. So President Bush fast-tracked the AIDS drugs, and sure enough, they got to the marketplace pretty quickly, didn't they? We didn't hear about the failures because there were quite a few failures out there. People got sicker because of some of the medications that were approved, but they were quickly pulled, but they were willing to try, because AIDS is devastatingly rapid in how fast it will kill you if you don't treat it quickly. In other industries, generally speaking, producers don't need to get that kind of permission. If I'm Bethlehem Steel and I go to a builder and I say, my steel's better than U.S. steel's because of these reasons, I don't have to be able to prove it with a package insert. I just can just say it. I don't have that kind of regulation. So it's obviously going to drive the price of drugs up, just that one thing alone. Instead, the government regulator may enforce these general standards and may ban individual products if the cause arises. There are a lot of patent medicines out there that come and go, right? And we have to be careful of those. And that probably is another economical lesson that you can teach your students. Don't invest in something that doesn't have, some proof behind it. The argument for pre-market approval, well, you can read this as well as I can, but it's about the profit motive. We don't want people to profit from things that they shouldn't be. This isn't a food or a drug product, but John Stossel likes to use on one of his videos the advertisement for a solar-powered dryer to dry your clothes with, and it costs $19.99. And so you send off for it, and what comes in the mail is a clothesline. So probably not worth $19.99, right? That's a true story, by the way. We don't want to buy into those kind of things. It was the snake oil salesman coming into town. Hey, I've got the Inca Hell Oil Tonic here. It'll grow your hair and cure your dyspepsia. Most of the time, it was alcohol, right? So in here we go, thalidomide. In 1957 to 1961, thalidomide killed and maimed thousands of people. I went to college at Indiana with a fellow student. He was a young man, brilliant guy, and he used to have little flippers for arms. His mother was Scottish. His father was a U.S. airman based in one of the air bases in Scotland right after World War II, and they met and fell in love and got married. And she conceived there when they were still in Scotland, and she took thalidomide. Thalidomide was an anti-nausea and supposed to calm the mother. So they used this drug liberally because it worked. It really, really, really worked well. But they kept it kind of quiet when these birth defects started to happen. They didn't, want to talk about a drug that everybody was enjoying taking because it made the pregnancy a little more tolerable. So it went on for 4 years. But what you may or may not know, that was restricted to Germany, for the most part, Germany and Great Britain. Anybody see the PBS series called Call the Midwife? Great show about midwifery in the late 1950s and early 1960s in the East End of London. And I think it's in its 6th or 7th season. In season 5 or 6, they introduced the thalidomide disaster that happened in Great Britain. But the reason it's not a real poignant issue here in the United States is because the FDA never approved thalidomide for marketing here. In Europe, it was called Distaval. In Great Britain, it was called Distaval. But it was never approved here. And the reason is because a watchdog organization here in the U.S. had its ear to the ground and was listening better than they were listening themselves. And it was a woman spokesperson for this watchdog agency, went to the FDA and said, hold off for just a little bit longer. Let's look at these results that are coming out. And they showed them pictures and gave them testimonials and things coming out of not only Great Britain and Germany, but also Canada. There were thalidomide cases in North America, but it was from Canada. I don't believe it ever got approved in Mexico. I'd have to look that up, but I don't think it ever got approved in Mexico. So here's the counter argument. As one organization tasked with oversight of utterly enormous universe of activity, 20% of all consumer activity, the regulator has little choice but to impose highly simplified and standardized practices. I mean, obviously cleanliness is one of those. You have to have a very clean environment to produce drugs and food. You have to have certain standards. That's why we have USDA Prime and USDA Choice and all those categorizations that we come to count on, right? And then standardization and simplification often reduce competition, and we know what that means. That slows growth, it slows profitability, and here in the free enterprise system, we kind of rely on those things. Innovation gets stymied, which means higher prices, delays in introduction of new drugs, and failures to overcome useful interventions. So we don't like that. We want them to have a lot more laissez-faire effect when it comes there. Another perfect example was in the 1960s, access to beta blockers was delayed. And this was almost completely due to lobbying by the companies that had ACE inhibitors and other hypertension drugs, high blood pressure drugs. Beta blockers are really good at it for certain people. Different channels for having hypertension in people, and beta blockers were really useful, and they were being used quite a bit in Western Europe to great success, but because of the lobbying by some of the pharmaceutical companies, they held them at bay. Bayer was one of those. They had a great beta blocker that was being widely used in Great Britain, but they could not get it introduced here. So here are the numbers, the scary numbers. I don't go much beyond 2010 here in this bar graph, but suffice it to say that it's gone up. Mainly because of regulation, but also because of advertising and marketing and the cost of input costs, all those supply shifters, right? So in the 1970s, basically for preclinical and clinical, the cost of introducing a new drug was somewhere, around $300 million. Then in the 1980s, it climbed up to $300 million. Then in the 1990 to 2000, it went all the way up to $600 million. And then in the 2000 to 2010, it went up, 1.5 billion. Now it's up over 2 in just the 8 years since 2010. And it just continues to climb. And everybody's looking for why is that continuing to exist. It's kind of scary. It's rampant. And we've got to do something. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to afford these innovations that come along in the treatment of illnesses.
Feedback.
Yeah, sure.
What changed why did the bar changes there? Preclinical became more expensive and the preclinical was more expensive in the 70s, 80s?
Regulation. The imposition of regulations. And also the fact that the restraint of trade. The pharmaceutical industry is no longer a perfect competition. It's now an oligopoly. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's just a few pharmaceutical companies left. All the rest of them are really, really small, with some are less than 20% of the marketplace. It's controlled by about 5 or 6 really, really large pharmaceutical companies. And so their clinical part went way up.
Wasn't there also a change in the extensivity that the FDA started requiring of clinical trials versus preclinical?
Yes, that helped drive it up too. And another answer is private insurance. And we're going to see that in the next presentation about healthcare and how private insurance has driven up the cost of not only drugs, but the care itself, hospitalization, so forth and so on. So it's multifactorial. So should we support or should we oppose liberalization? Well, it's proven really hard to do that. I mean, should we allow pharmaceutical companies to come out quicker and without as much due diligence and just kind of take our chances, or should we continue to allow the FDA to put into place these regulations? And it's really, if you're for or against the pre-market approval, it's really what it comes down to. My brother had chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and he developed it really early in life, probably because he was exposed to radiation. It runs in my family, and it does tend to be familiar, and it usually affects men, and it hits them somewhere in their late 60s or early 70s. My grandfather got it. My father did not get it. But my brother was a nuclear safety and licensing engineer. His specialty was wastewater treatment plant design, so he worked in the nuclear industry a lot. And he was exposed to his badge never turned red, as he would say. You wear the little nuclear badge, and if it turns red, it means, oh, you've reached your number of rads and you can't be exposed anymore for a certain period of time. My badge never turned red, he said. But mutation's mutation, right? No matter how much radiation it takes to cause a mutation to happen, it happens. So he was diagnosed at 35, and he was always in search of a better lifestyle, and he took really good care of himself, and he lived way beyond the curve. He lived 18 years after his diagnosis, and shouldn't have. He probably should have been gone in about 5. So he defied the system, but he would have loved to have had a medication come along that would have cured him of his CLL. He would have loved that. He ended up using the drug that I was promoting. It was a secondary drug. He developed a malnutrition syndrome caused by myelodysplastic syndrome. So one of the drugs that they tried had the opposite effect, made him sicker. So it may not matter regarding the FDA. It really may not matter. If I have a friend I play tennis with, his wife goes to Switzerland every 3 months to get a novel treatment that's not available here in the United States. They're paying for it out of pocket. He worked for Lockheed Martin. He was an executive with them. He's retired now. He's 82, actually. Still plays good tennis, too, by the way. But she goes over there to get that, defying the FDA. I don't have to stay here in the United States. I'll go to Switzerland and get my treatment. And guess what? It's working. She has a really a weird form of breast cancer. And I don't know exactly what the treatment is, but it's working. She's been going for 3 years now, and she's not dead. So proof is in the pudding, right? But it might matter if it's proposed to impose pre-market approval on other industries. So in other words, if we start to dial in on the steel industry or the automobile industry. The automobile industry for a while had a lot of safety belts and the airbags and the glass not cutting you to shreds if you went through the windshield, so forth and so on. They kind of stopped it, didn't they? Anybody ever seen a movie called Tucker, A Man in His Dream?
I showed that every year.
It's a great movie. It's an economics movie.
I showed that every year.
It's totally an economics movie, isn't it?
For sure.
It's about oligopoly trying to break into the automobile industry. It's a true story. Right after Preston Tucker, he's an actual guy. He worked in the military industrial complex during World War II. Came up with several novel ideas.
The turret.
Yeah, the turret, the Tucker turret, which was in the underbelly of the bombers.
B-25 bombers.
Yep, and it
My
worked.
dad was an Air Force colonel, so I know.
Yep, saved a lot of lives. It was bulletproof and pretty cool. And
Again, Tucker,
A Man in His Dream. And they actually did get a car introduced, and it was made it 1 year. But regulation and lobbying and yep.
There's one right over in Prestonwood area. I know the guy that owns one.
They're worth so much money.
They're worth like $250,000.
That's minimum.
That's minimum.
That's minimum.
Only 2 of them have been destroyed.
Yeah.
Of the ones that were produced.
Somebody had the foresight to. It was very innovative. So if that starts to happen, and probably the pharmaceutical industry wouldn't mind it if it did start to happen a little bit. Anybody ever heard of the Sunshine Act? It came out about 10 years ago, I think. Henry Waxman, who was a congressperson from California, became aware of the fact that there were a lot of excesses in the pharmaceutical industry in their expenditures to entertain and to advertise, come up with pins that went like that. I know when I was with Bayer, we had a device to get it into the doctors' heads. It was called a Cipro Avalox toolkit. We had these 2 fluoroquinolones, And it was a toolkit that it was leather and had a zipper on it, and you open it up and it had a hammer and pliers and a set of Allen wrenches and scissors and a box cutter, and I mean, it was a really nice, portable toolkit. And I remember when they showed us that, we were going in to give it to doctors, to select doctors. We weren't giving it to everybody. I actually said to my district manager, I said, "Man, how much did that thing cost?" And it had to cost. I mean, so I went to a specialty hardware store and looked it up at Brookstone, I think it was, and it was like $140. Of course, that was high retail. We bought them in bulk. But even if it was 50 or 60 bucks, my gosh, that's huge. That's more than a pen or a pad, isn't it? So he looked at those excesses and he said, "Hey, hang on a second. I appreciate the fact that you've got to market your drugs and that you've got to do things to influence people and get their attention and so forth and so on. But guess what? My Medicare and my Medicaid constituents, they have to pay for that. And guess who's paying for Medicare and Medicaid? All of us." So they've passed the Sunshine Act, and now my wife can't leave a pen or a pad. All she can do is leave stuff like this. Those days are gone. You can still bring lunch into a physician's office, but that you can't take them to dinner anymore, nothing. And so if they started doing that to other industries, you better believe it would change things. So it'd probably be unlikely that that'll happen. So here's some of the activities and assignments. Obviously, you're going to lecture over this information. You're going to talk about supply shifters and even demand shifters. You could apply this to demand shifters if you wanted to. Videos. There's an FDA official proponent of liberalization that talks about tight regulation. These are on their website. Their webpage has this really great video, I'm not going to show it today, about how to start a food business. Because there's a lot of kids out there who are entrepreneurial, and that's a good place to break in.
Yeah, marijuana.
Well, marijuana could be one of them. Absolutely. I mean, and he's not just talking about the type of marijuana that would get you high either. The cannabinol products that have the oil in them and things like that that are proving to be quite useful in some populations.
A bottle that big costs $90.
Yep. That big right there. Yep, because it has to be pure. It has to follow the standards. And there are a lot of people who are getting a lot of benefit from that. And there are a lot of entrepreneurial people who are starting to bank on it. And believe me, I've got a couple of friends in Colorado that I went to college with that are making big money off of the marijuana industry there.
Yeah, they got like 8 modules right now. You could get certified as a medicinal marijuana certifier in the United States. They're going to close it down by the end of June. They're only taking so many, so many people that finish those modules. It costs $2,600. I mean, I know because my sister's medicinal marijuana up in Camden, so I know all this stuff anyway. So.
Yep.
But that is true.
Yeah.
And,
So see,
there's it locks down. It's done.
Yeah.
And
So
when they get the certifiers in the United States, they're going to be certified for every state that has medicinal marijuana that they ship to. And I think that's just about every one of them now.
So that's a perfect example of there being economic opportunity inside the regulations. Inside the regulations, there's opportunity. But there are a lot of kids who want to start a food truck. I mean, it's a very popular thing to do now is to have a food truck, right? Taco truck, hamburger truck, whatever it might be. Those are extremely popular. To this day, I don't know why.
They're not regulated by the FDA, are they? They're regulated by like the local community inspectors and stuff like that.
The food products that are actually in the truck may be,
Yeah,
they might be the quality of the
but
meat.
I don't
and so
think
forth.
so because if they're produced in Dallas and they go to food trucks and they go to construction sites, because I know guys that own
Sure.
food trucks. I don't remember them
No.
being FDA.
No, but you bring up a good point. So a natural extension from talking about just the FDA would be health departments and things like that, and the regulations that and the costs that they're borne up there too. So you make a good point. There are essays by economists on trusts and markets in the back of the book that you can use to stimulate activity, and you can have them do essays on the need for pre-market approval. There are all kinds of podcasts about medicine in the FDA, so just do a little due diligence. on your part as an educator, and you can find some podcasts that are absolutely amazing. They're short too, like 2-3 minutes long. You have them listen to those, or find it on YouTube. Yeah, find it on YouTube. And then there are videos talking about the FDA's work. They're really kind of proud of their work, and they need to be, and we should be proud of their work. I mean, you know, if it weren't for their cautiousness, we would have had thalidomide here in the United States, and that, you know, would have been devastating. So this is the old DuPont phrase, right? Better living through chemistry. Any other questions? And I meant to say at the beginning, I prefer to take questions during the presentation, so you guys have helped me with that. Yes?
Question that I had asked once of a connection between the move of pharmaceuticals towards an oligopoly and FDA restrictions. That basically the restrictions are so high that unless you have the type of level of income and the resources to be able to support that, you could never get your drug to market in the first place.
That's right. That's right. So it's self-perpetuating, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if anything, it's going to move it towards a monopoly.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Affordable Care Act, I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole, might spawn that, might have spawned that. And that was, of course, one of the big things. We'll talk about that in the next presentation. Great segue. Any others?